Hey, my name is Bryce and welcome back to my YouTube channel, Jack of Trades. So it's been a while since we put out a video, but we've been busy with our new project. We started a project to convert an iconic 1/10 buggy to 1/5 scale. So we put it out to you, the viewers, to decide which car you would like to see as a 5th scale. And the choices were the Team Associated RC2, Yokomo YZ10, the Team Associated RC10, and the new Tamiya BBX. Though it's not really an iconic car, it's kind of a cool car that would still be very cool as a 5th scale buggy. But from the poll, the RC10 had 44% of the vote, so that is the car that we have gone with. So we're already a week into the project, and this video is the kickoff to build a 1/5 scale RC10. So I'm calling it the RC5 team build. You know, if you look at kind of the historic naming of the Team Associated cars, they had an RC12 for their 12 scale cars, they had an RC10 for their 10 scale cars. So it seemed logical that the 5th scale buggy would be an RC5. So in 2024, Team Associated will be celebrating their 60-year anniversary, and it'll also be the 40-year anniversary for the RC10. It will be interesting to see if Team Associated does anything in response to that milestone. We've seen it with Kyosho this year with the re-release of quite a few vintage kits, kind of limited edition releases. It would be cool if Team Associated did something special. I think there is a huge market for the vintage RC cars. We even see Yokomo coming out with their 870/YZ10 later this year, hopefully. So all the companies are kind of hopping on that bandwagon of re-releasing vintage cars. And I think it would be awesome if Team Associated did something as well. There's actually quite a few companies that are supporting the vintage RC10s. So you've got Fan RC doing injection molded parts, basically doing a complete plastic kit for the RC10 and the RC10T. And there's companies doing carbon fiber chassis, as well as there's other companies that are working on doing the gold anodized sheet metal parts for these cars. So I think within the next year or two, there will be enough kind of third-party manufacturers making enough parts where you could build an RC10 from scratch with new reproduction parts from these vendors, which would be really cool. Because then, so those of you that have kind of missed out on the RC10 as a child, and they missed out on the re-release back in the early 2009s, I think, that you have that opportunity to build that car. And if Associated hops on the bandwagon of re-releasing vintage cars, then there might be another opportunity to join in getting an RC10. But it's pure speculation. There's been no leaks of anything special happening, but it would seem like a missed opportunity if Associated didn't do anything. So let's get into my build. I have spent the week designing parts. There's a lot of parts that go into an RC car. I forget what the part count is on this car, or the unique part count, not including screws, but it's up there, probably around 60 to 70 parts. And I'm actually kind of that's a conservative guesstimate. I think when I did a manual count in my head, I was around 50 pieces, but I'm sure I was missing parts like the individual bits that go into the shocks, as well as the gearbox. So my goal has been to try to model at least 3 parts a day for my assembly. I am planning on modeling the entire car because I'm going to use that model to validate the design, just to make sure that when I make the parts I don't run into any interferences. So I'm going to invest the effort in designing those parts. And in the process of designing those parts, I'm actually kind of re-engineering the parts, trying to, if I was designing this from scratch, what would I change? What size screws would I use? How many screws would I use? What would I change in the design to make it more effective or more durable? So it's kind of my own. It's not a one-to-one copy of an RC10, but it's my own twist on an RC10, while kind of maintaining the vintage vibe on this car. One of the things that's kind of weird is these braces for the nose piece. They're not really parallel with the chassis, and I kind of get why they did that, because If they were parallel, then they come pretty low, and there's a lot of stuff that gets stuffed underneath these braces with your front bulkheads or arm supports and your shock tower that you don't quite have enough room for that. But in my model, I've actually lowered this nose a little bit so that it's in plane with this back here, and that these braces are actually parallel to the chassis, to the bottom of the chassis. And what that means is I have less room underneath here, and I've had to kind of trim down some parts. So this is kind of a retro mod build that I did as a carpet racer. So it uses a classic gold pan chassis, but then it's got kind of world's style shock towers. It's got the original gold anodized shocks, not the hard body shocks. But I've upgraded to a ball bearing bell crank system, titanium tie rods, Andes injection molded arms. Still running dog bones in the rear, not CVDs. It's got a 17.5 brushless system. I actually have a video that goes over this car and the changes I made to it. But it's a fairly stock car with some kind of tasteful upgrades. I do have a battery holder here for a shorty LiPo setup. And I'm running these J-Concepts wheels, which are basically wheels, tires combined that you buy from J-Concepts. So let's get into where we're at with our build for the 5th scale. So we've got the model going, I've got the wheels and tires. I wanted to start with the wheels and tires because those are going to be 3D printed. And what we see here are the first test prints of those tires. So we're doing kind of the classic 4-rib front tire and the staggered 4-3 pattern, 4-3 studs on the rear wheel. I'm using TPU for these test prints. One of the problems I was having is that when it sits on the print bed like this, it has to build up supports on the bottom to kind of support this shallow projection that comes off the bed. With most 3D prints, the supports create a very poor finish on the part, and so usually you try to hide those surfaces where the supports go, which is why this is on the back side. It becomes even more problematic with the TPU because it doesn't get good bonds between those layers, and it actually ends up looking really, really bad. I've intentionally not shown photos, but this tire is after spending an hour or two kind of smoothing it over with a hot iron, and actually filling in the voids with additional filament manually. I was on the RC10 Talk forum, and someone had suggested a very clever method for avoiding this issue, and that is to print the tires in 2 pieces, and then you bond them together. So here I did this cavity intentionally, and then I've got 2 bonding surfaces, basically the inner diameter and the outer diameter. But I'm going to print 2 of these halves, and I'm going to bond them together. The guy on the forum recommended using Flex Seal, but I've also found that you can bond TPU with heat. You basically melt the material. It's a thermoset material, and then you melt it, and then you put the 2 halves together, and you let it cool off. Sounds easy. The challenge is getting it lined up properly, and then when we've got these studs or spikes in the middle, you got to get those clocked correctly as well. So I'm going to have to come up with a fixture that allows me to hold this, or basically bring the 2 halves together while they're hot and get them perfectly lined up. The fact that we're dealing with a material that is basically rapidly cooling as you're trying to bring those 2 halves together, I suspect it'll be a process that does not go well. And this stuff is, this material is actually very, very durable. So when it comes together, it doesn't want to separate. So if we heat this up, we bring the halves together and they're misaligned, there's no taking that apart. That's a one-shot deal. But you can see, to help control kind of the squishiness of this material, you control the infill. So like this has a 7% infill. This has, I think, a 15% infill. And they're not very sticky. It's not. It feels like a really old vintage tire that's gone dry. They kind of hit like hard plastic, but they are quite durable. I can go and squish this. I can do that to it, and it doesn't tear, it doesn't crack. It just kind of comes back. So it's a very durable material, but it's not very compliant, and it's not very grippy, I would say. Though that's what the tread is for grip. So actually, and this is also, so this is TPU. These are all TPU. What I've done to kind of break, this is what it looks like coming off the printer, minus the supports that I pulled off for the studs, because it prints like this, so there's supports that go around. So I've stripped those off, and then to go from kind of glossy to dull, I glass bead blast them in my blast cabinet, and that kind of makes it a little more realistic in looks. This kind of looks plasticky because it is plasticky. This looks a little more like rubber. So right now I have another material on the printer that I'm trying out. It's called TPE, and it's more like real rubber. I'm hoping that I can get a good print off of it, and get a kind of a more rubber-like tire. But I will also be doing that in halves and then trying to bond the two halves together. I am going to try with a smaller tire because it uses less material and it's a faster print. These prints take a long time. I'm not very good at... I run my printer pretty conservatively, so I tend to lean towards long prints to get good prints. But it's a time investment where if something goes wrong, you've lost that time. I mean, granted, it's time that you're not standing around waiting. You're just kind of setting it and forgetting it. But like this took 32 hours to print for this tire. This took 18 hours to print. I think this took like 24 hours. Actually, no, that doesn't seem right. This might have been 16 hours. I don't remember. This is the first one I did, so it was a couple days ago, so I've already forgotten how long it took. So the point is, printing takes a long time, and there's a lot of things I want to print. And so I need another printer. And I've had another printer. I've had this printer for better portion of this year. I got this, I think, in January. But I just haven't built it up. And so this week I'm going to focus on building up this printer so that I can have two printers running as I'm trying to get these tires sorted out. So let me back up a little bit. For the fabrication of my 5th scale RC10, I'm going to be employing a pretty large variety of fabrication and manufacturing techniques. And actually I've got a lot of materials on order and they're just starting to kind of trickle in. I've got some aluminum hex rod here, so I'm going to be doing some hex rod parts. I've got a bunch of titanium bar stock, like the hinge pins, the tie rods. Those will all be titanium. Actually, the tie rods I might go aluminum. It depends, but the hinge pins will definitely be titanium. The shock towers will either be carbon fiber or graphite. I have some graphite panels coming in. What else? All the suspension parts that are originally nylon, I'm planning on machining out of nylon. And then for the arms, I actually might look at using either Delrin or nylon. I have some Delrin as well that I might make the arms out of. For the parts that are a little more difficult to manufacture, I'm going to be leveraging kind of the library parts from the HPI Baja 5B just because it's the right scale and I'm familiar with those parts and I know that they work. There are other 5th scale companies out there like FG or Team Losi even has 5th scale parts, but I have a fairly healthy collection of HPI Baja parts, so I'm going to use that. So for the rod ends, I'll be looking at the HPI Baja rod ends. The shocks, I'll be trying to utilize parts from the HPI Baja shocks, but I do want to incorporate design elements from the RC10 shocks into the Baja shocks. So I want to use a similar cap design that we see on the RC10s. I like the large hexes. These are kind of synonymous with RC10 shocks, as well as the bottom, the retainers for the springs and the rod ends on the bottom. The rod ends on the bottom are a little more difficult, so I might lean on the HPI Baja, even though they won't be white, they'll be gray. Also for the internals on the transmission, I'm planning on using an HPI Baja differential as well as the gear train. And actually it turns out that they match quite closely. This is a spur gear on HPI Baja and it is almost exactly 1/5 scale to the 1/10 scale spur gear here. Obviously that doesn't mean much when you talk about the final drive ratio, but I'm basically going to be doing the same drive ratio as you would find on an HPI Baja Flux, which I have driven, and that is a nice responsive buggy. So that's kind of what I'm aiming for, is that same final drive ratio that we get out of the HPI Baja buggy, but in the form factor of an RC10 setup. All right, what else? This is turning out to be a long rambling video just because there's a lot going on with this, and I've kind of a lot of my ideas are coming to fruition, and I figure if I document it, then it'll help me remember it later when I've forgotten everything. The drive cups will be from the HPI Baja. Drive shafts, maybe I might actually machine my own drive shafts just because I need to make sure I have the right lengths. If I do that, I don't know if I'll go through the trouble of heat treating them, so that it might just be kind of a mild still or some kind of a tool still without the heat treating. We'll see. I've done that before in the past and it works okay. It's obviously better to heat treat the materials to get the most strength you can out of it. But it's an expense, you know, for a couple of parts to do a heat treat run. I think you're talking about, I haven't heat treated parts in a long time, but it's probably, I would guess it's between $100 and $200 to do a heat treat run. Just for a handful of parts, it's not really worth it. So the chassis, I'm going to do a sheet, I've got sheet metal coming. I'm using 1/8 inch 5052-H32, which has, you can cold work that without it cracking, unlike 6061 T6. You basically, if you want to work 6061, you have to draw it back almost to a T0 and then you can work it. And by then it's actually not very strong anymore. So I feel like, I think the 5052 is a much better material for working. And it is good to weld because I'm going to go the route of welding on the side plates and then kind of blending that weld so you don't see it. So it has good weldability, and it takes an anodize. Sometimes you get materials that don't anodize very well. If the aluminum alloy has silicon in it, the silicon causes the anodize to turn black. So 5052 is good for anodizing, it's good for welding, it's good for forming. So it seemed like the obvious material for the skill set and tools that I have in my garage. I don't have large sheet metal tools for bending, breaking, shearing, so I'm going to have to basically CNC cut that plate out, or you could do it on a jigsaw, but I have CNC capabilities, so I might as well use them. And then cold work the material into shape, and then weld it, and then do a lot of sanding and blending to kind of make it look the part. I think that covers most of it. Back to 3D printing. So the one thing I can't machine, or the one thing I don't want to get into machining is wheels. It's a lot of work. I suppose I could, but I don't want to. So man, it wouldn't be that big of a deal to machine them. I have the tire size embossed on my tires. So these are 105s by 147s by 37, 105 being the ID. So I'm just thinking 105 millimeter ID, that's basically 4-inch round bar that I would have to machine. I am doing the classic jelly bean style, so that means each wheel is 2 pieces. I don't think I want to, and I just have a manual lathe, so it's a lot of work to machine wheels. So initially I'm going to print them. If this thing kind of goes better than I hope, maybe I'll machine them just to kind of get rid of those print layers lines. It's not completely out of my wheelhouse to machine them, but it's just a lot of work. I'm thinking of the wheel profile in my head right now, and what it would take to machine, and it's not too bad. So we'll see. Initially, I'm going to print wheels, and that's why I have this nylon material here. It's a natural nylon, kind of an off-white. So I'm going to print those wheels, and they might be the final wheels unless I do decide to go ahead and machine them. I would have to buy a 4-inch, actually probably have to go like a 4.5 or 5-inch round bar stock of nylon, which isn't going to be cheap. We're talking probably $100 to $200 for a bar big enough to make those wheels. These materials are expensive. The nylon's expensive. Ironically, the titanium you would think would be expensive, but it seems to be reasonably priced. The aluminum's not too bad, but the sheet metal is expensive. But I'm getting enough material where I could potentially make 2 cars, and I probably will end up with enough parts for 2 cars, just because I'll be making spares, and I might have to do more than one version. The other use for the 3D printing is I will use it to make prototype parts before I start making chips. And that allows me to make sure the design is good and I can test fit it. before I go and spend the time machining. Because machining, I mean, you could spend a week just making one part, depending how many setups it has. You know, I can see like these little triangle bulkhead pieces. I think there's 1, 2, 3, at least 3 or 4 operations on that to make that part. This rear bulkhead, that's 1, 2, 3, 4 operations. That's another week-long part. So some of these parts can take quite a while to manufacture. The uprights are fairly complicated. Those will take a while to make. And so I will be 3D printing these initially just to see how they fit, and then before I make the real part, before I machine the real part. I might even go as far as printing them and running them, and then if they hold up, I might just leave it as a 3D printed part, and then if they start breaking, I can revert back to machining them. So we'll see how lazy I get with machining. Usually if I can 3D print it and it holds up, I have no desire to machine it, but I am kind of planning on machining parts, but I do have enough filament to print out the parts that I need. And then I have this yellow that I got because originally I was thinking of, well, this car is kind of a mishmash of original and Worlds. If you look at the Worlds tires or wheels, so here's the Worlds wheels. They're basically these kind of neon yellow dishes. So I picked up some neon yellow filament that looks like a pretty close match to the Worlds, and I might end up, you know, if I have enough parts for 2 of these, I might do a classic gold pen and then a World style buggy. And so if we look at this, this is a half assembled Worlds car. This is the Worlds car. I just think they call it a classic, but it's not. It's just the RC10 Worlds re-release. The chassis is obviously black. We've got black suspension arms. We've got these FRP chassis, or FRP shock stays. Looks like I'm missing a wing tube here. That's interesting. It does have CVDs. I do actually have Baja CVDs that I could possibly use. The drive shafts wouldn't be the right length. This has ball differential versus a gear diff, but that doesn't matter. I would still use HPI Baja internals, stealth transmission. So if I have enough pieces, I might do a Worlds chassis as well, where it gets anodized black, and then we kind of do the machined lightning slots on it, which is kind of iconic for the Worlds chassis. And then the nose piece is black as well. But that would be an interesting option for us. One thing I'm not going to do is a slipper. With the fifth scale stuff, it's hard to get a slipper that can hold up to the power that you put into it. I actually designed a slipper for the HPI Baja, and I had a buddy that was racing at the time, and he raced with it, and it worked. And then HPI actually came out with a slipper at one point as well. Mine was first. But it's difficult to do slippers, so I'm not going to mess with the slipper. What I will do is I will use the HPI to kind of help limit the shock to the drivetrain. They have these little rubber inserts that go in here, and then they have the gear carrier, which is coupled to the lay shaft, has pins that go into those rubber dampers, and so those rubber dampers basically take up the shock between the wheels and the motor, or in the case of the Baja, the engine. So I will be implementing that in the design, but I'm not going to mess around with the slipper, at least for now. You know, I'm kind of talking about this like it's like a one and done deal, but I just realized that this car could be easily, you know, expanded upon, where maybe at some point I do want to do a slipper, and I kind of expand that lay shaft out to incorporate a slipper. But at this point, just to get the car running, I'm not going to mess with the slipper. What else? I feel like that's a lot. We got our motor. We got a motor. I don't know if this is the motor I want to run. This is an 1100 kV. It's 1/5 scale. I need to actually look and see the difference between this and their 800 kV. On the Baja, I'm running 800 kV sensorless motor. This is a censored motor, so that's one of the big differences between these two motors. That and it's about 40% faster than the 800 kV. But I'm not really looking for crazy speeds. The Baja is plenty fast, which means the fifth-scale RC10 will be plenty fast. So I'm kind of on the fence of whether I want to use this motor. What else? Oh, so as if I didn't have enough on my plate, I thought I would, while I'm going through the build of the RC10, not the fabrication, but the actual assembly. So I think what I'll do is I'll do videos covering the fabrication and design of the car, and then I'll do kind of a build as if it was a brand new in the box kit. But in the process of that, I want to also cover the build of a real RC10, and actually it'll be a restoration build. So if we're doing a gold pan, I want to take one of my gold pans. I've got this guy here. I've actually got it kitted out for a rebuild. I've got some parts in here, but this car is otherwise in really good shape. This is an original. Well, it's not original. It's actually got a mixture of shocks. These look like Kyosho shocks almost. I didn't realize that. And then we've got some vintage RC10 shocks back here with the black shock body caps. So these also look like they're kind of a mix of things. And then it's got the 6-gear transmission. So these shocks don't necessarily go with this chassis. But that's fine. We'll find some. I have some original RC10 shocks that I can throw on here. But I thought I'd do a restoration build on one of the gold pans to follow along with the 5th-scale build and kind of do them side by side. So I thought that would be interesting because I don't have enough to do already. And then if we do in this car, so this is a B stamp chassis, so it's kind of like I think this is probably a Cadillac chassis. It's in pretty good shape. There's obviously scuff marks from use. Since I am going to be anodizing my chassis, I will take some of the vintage parts that are need to be reworked, and I'll strip them down and send them out for anodize. I'll sand this down so it's smooth and send it out for re-anodization. One thing that's kind of interesting on the nose piece, so the nose piece has some really funky bends in it. It goes flat inside the chassis, and there's a little Z bend. Then it goes flat again, so there's an offset between the inside and the outside. Or there's an offset between those two flat plates, and then it kicks up 30 degrees, and it kicks up to a somewhat vertical nose piece. So it's got a lot of bends in it, and what worries me is that Z bend. I can mess around with it, but there's an online sheet metal shop called Oshcut, and you basically can upload your model of your sheet metal part and get an instant quote. And so for a 5th-scale nose piece, the cost was like $11. And there's a setup fee. It's like a $40 setup fee, but that $40 setup fee is for a one-time deal. So you can make 20 nose pieces, and you got one setup fee, and then the price actually goes down in quantity. So I know like 4 pieces the price drops to like $10. So in principle, you can make the pricing is really reasonable, and you can make a bunch of nose pieces for fairly cheap. But what would be interesting is to make some nose pieces for the vintage cars, because the nose pieces are usually pretty scraped up. And they just do sheet metal bending, so you'd still have to do the anodizing and the engraving, but you could do, and the RC10s are actually stamped, but you could engrave that on the mill. And so that's probably what I'll end up doing is I'll order the nose pieces from Oshcut. Then I'll do the post machine, because I am engraving the name of the car on the nose piece, and I'll send it out for anodize with the chassis. So yeah. And what else? I think I already said it, but if we do the world's car, then we'll kind of strip this down and we'll do a build side by side with the world's car and the 5th-scale world's car version. So that is it. Sorry for the long video. This is kind of a video of me rambling about the project. There's a lot going on with it. It should be pretty exciting if you're into this stuff, if you like listening to me ramble. There is another guy out there that was doing a fifth scale, Morton Max. He's on Facebook, and then he was working with another guy. But basically, Morton is building a fifth scale RC10 as well. His is more kind of staying true to the original car, and then this other guy was, I think, designing the plastic parts in CAD and then uploading the shapeways to get printed. So Morton's got a pretty complete kit going. I wouldn't say it's a kit because he's not selling it, but it's his build. His build is pretty complete. He is missing some key pieces, but he's got all the suspension arms and the bulkheads and the uprights, and so it's kind of cool seeing his fifth scale RC10. He did a gold pan chassis that he handmade in his shop, where he basically started with the flat plates and folded up the sides, but left where they wrap around. He left those loose, and then he kind of formed them in to follow the profile of the chassis, and then welded up the corners, and then feathered out those welds so you don't see them. So he did a really good job on that chassis, and I hope that I can achieve the same quality of work in my chassis. So we'll see. So, alright, so we'll leave it at that. Thanks for tuning in and watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit that like and subscribe button. If you're already a subscriber, I do appreciate it. Thank you for your time. Take care. Bye.